Hey y'all, and welcome back to my channel. In this tutorial, we're going to be making this winter scene cutting board to match the Winter Wonderland tumbler that we made before. I have made a bunch of these in the past, and I have a couple of tutorials for them, but I got my boards from Hobby Lobby and I was unable to find any more, but my mom found some at Marshall's and TJ Maxx. So she brought me some and said, and this one's for me. So I thought it would be cute to make her one for Christmas. All right, so let's just jump right in. We are going to do our best to match the ombre that I have on the original Winter Wonderland tumbler. With the crazy paint shortage, I could not find the exact colors, so I got these 3 chalk paints from the craft section in Walmart, and they actually worked really well. What I need to do is get my hands on some of that pop of color paint that everyone is bragging about, but I have yet to buy any, maybe in the near future. I'm such a procrastinator when it comes to supplies, or if I need something, I will just try to make what I have work to avoid buying something else. Even though I can see everyone ranting and raving about it, I'm like, no, you can use this. Why buy more paint when you already have spray paint? Or you can buy, you know, the 99-cent stuff from Walmart and make it work. Yeah, that's me. But then I finally get it. I try it and I'm like, why have I not tried this before? What took me so long? So anyway, if y'all have some suggestions on really good either acrylics or some sort of paint to use a brush with and not spray on your cup, I don't really want to use airbrush. So anything that you can paint on, drop them below and I'll check it out and finally make some purchases on a paint collection. Okay, enough about that. Let's get back to the tutorial. So as you can see, I am painting on my chalk paints and just doing my best to blend them in between each color. You want to move into the next color while the previous is still wet so you can blend those together. This is going to take 2 coats because we're going to be using a opal glitter. So you're going to be able to see pretty good through it, so I want good coverage on this. And I didn't tape the sides off because we are later going to go back and sand them. And this board has some really crisp edges, so if you are careful, it is easy not to go over the side. And when I went back in with my second coat, I did tape the bottom off so I get a nice crisp line at the bottom. And I'm sorry, y'all, it does not show me doing the final coat on this because my phone died and yeah, it didn't record. But we're going to apply our glitter using the epoxy method, and I have about 5 milliliters of epoxy mixed here, and we're probably going to use about 1 milliliter to really thinly apply this. And as you can see, I'm pulling the epoxy around on the board as best as possible to get that coat really thin, and I'm only going to the edge. I do not want to go over it. And the reason I chose to use the epoxy method is because, for one, it is very thin, it's not gloopy, and you can get excellent coverage with a tiny amount, and we want to put as less as possible on this board so we have less coats of epoxy before we can add our decals on. I would say that you could also use the tack-it method because that would get a really pretty effect with the glitter. And it would also be thin, but I would not use anything like Mod Podge or any kind of glue adhesive to adhere the glitter to the board. That way it is not, it's as thin as it can be. And then I'm going to go straight in with Astrid from PDB Creative Studio. This is like the most gorgeous opal that you can have. I absolutely love it. And as you can see, I use it a lot. I think this is like my 3rd bottle in a few months. Oh, just look at it. It's so gorgeous. Okay, so we're going to take a piece of paper cardstock, something to protect your hands, and give a flat surface. And I'm going to push that glitter down. Y'all have seen me do this with my tumblers in my previous videos. This does not affect the look of the glitter. It just pushes it down so that you have less coats of epoxy in between your decals. I'm going to remove that tape immediately so it does not dry to my board. And I used a little extra ink epoxy. So I waited about 3.5 hours, and then I come back in with, this is actually temporary removable vinyl because I ran out of tape. And then we're going to apply a nice coat of a little extra ink epoxy to our glitter. Now, I mixed up 60 milliliters of epoxy because I did anticipate using quite a bit on this, but I actually had enough left over after all 3 boards to epoxy a 20-ounce tumbler. So I would say we probably used about 15 milliliters on this. A little extra gives amazing coverage and it dries really fast. So yeah, it did not take much at all. Now, when you are applying your epoxy, just go really slow. Don't just dump a bunch of epoxy on your board so you have to wipe it off. Start with a little amount and then add as you go. That way you are not pushing too much epoxy to the edge of your board and not having any run over. And on the edges and around the handle, if you have one, you can see that I'm just tapping the epoxy around. Epoxy is self-leveling, so once we take a torch to this, it will level itself out, but dabbing it around helps avoid pulling it over the edge and pushing it into areas that we don't want it to go. Now, depending on your epoxy, you may have to do 2 coats. I actually anticipated on doing 2 coats, but a little extra does give really good coverage, so I only had to do 1 coat of epoxy on this. I allowed it to dry for about 3 hours, removed the tape, and then 6 to 8 hours later, I was ready to apply my decal. Now, I did not show how to compose this decal and print to cut in this tutorial because it is in the tutorial for the winter scene tumbler. I will link that at the end of this video and down in the description with all of the products that I used so that you guys can watch that too and get a really detailed tutorial on how to print and cut and compose this image. I just changed the image really slightly just to make it a little bit better for this board rather than the tumbler, and measured my board from side to side to make sure that it was going to fit, and then print and cut that. Now I'm jumping straight into adding my snowflakes, but if you are more comfortable with a barrier in between your image and your paints, then definitely either tape the bottom portion of this off, wrap it with clear wrap, and give a good coat of Rust-Oleum matte clear coat, and add yourself on a really thin layer of epoxy before you do this step. But I am just taking the end of a paintbrush, dabbing it in my paint, and dabbing it around my board. That's it. And don't forget to go over your image as well, so the snow looks like it is falling over your image. Then once this dries completely, I'm going to put something on my board to protect the bottom. Give it a good coat of Rust-Oleum matte clear coat and a coat of epoxy. As you can see, I have already added a layer of epoxy here, and we're going to move directly into adding on our snow while that epoxy is still wet. Keep in mind I am doing 3 boards, but what I have here was probably about 5 milliliters, and that was still way too much for all 3 boards. So I'm going to take some snow mica from PDB Creative Studio, and I'm going to dab a tiny bit of that onto my board on the bottom portion, beginning at the bottom of my image. And once I have the snow on, I'm going to take my gloved hand and just dab it around sort of in a circular motion because we want it to look like little floofs of snow, and sort of cover up those harsh lines of the printed image to make it look like it's really painted on this board. Once I finished that, I ran over very quickly with my torch. I don't want to heat it too much because I don't want my little floofs of snow to move, and gave it about 3 hours, removed my tape, and allowed that to dry overnight so we could move into sanding. We want some really smooth edges, so I'm going to go in with a 60 grit piece of sandpaper first and go over those edges sort of at an angle, not taking away the edge, but just knocking down that grittiness of the glitter and removing any excess that we got over the side. If your board has some sort of handle like this one does, don't forget the space in the center of your handle, because that definitely does not have as good of coverage as the center of your board, so you're going to want to sand that and get that nice and smooth as well. Once we have the glitter pretty smooth and the edges, I'm going to go in with 180 grit sandpaper over the entire board. This is going to ensure that my epoxy, since I'm going to do a thin coat on top of this, it is going to stick to the board and not repel in any areas. It's also going to smooth out the edges just a little bit more. And then once I finish with this one, I'm going in with a 500 grit to go over the entire board. Going over the wood on the bottom is not entirely necessary, and of course you can use different grits of sandpaper. This is just what I had on hand, and just kidding, it was 400 grit, not 500. But it was totally necessary for me because I'm messy and I got some epoxy on that bottom portion of this board, so I did have to go over with the sandpaper. But this is a bamboo board, so it sanded really, really well. If you have a different type of wood and you feel that you need to finish it off with some sort of oil, you can get a wood oil from a hardware store, or Walmart even has it. And once you complete your board, you can put that on a rag and just give it a really nice finish. And you'll never even be able to tell that you sanded that wood. I'm adding about 15 milliliters of a little extra ink epoxy. Again, another really thin coat, but this one just a tad bit more than the prior one, just to give it a really good coverage and a beautiful shine. Be sure to be very particular on this coat and make sure that you are getting excellent coverage everywhere and covering all of those places where you just sanded. I allowed this to sit for about 4 hours before I removed my tape this time. I wanted to have a really nice crisp line since it was my final coat. And this board was all done. As always, all the materials that I used in this tutorial will be in the description below, along with the tutorial for the tumbler, so that you can check out how I composed the image. The only thing that will not be down there is where to get this board. I used to be able to get them from Hobby Lobby, but they usually have them during springtime. Otherwise, you can find, random ones on Amazon, or really inexpensive ones at places like TJ Maxx and Burke's or Marshall's. So have fun shopping. Thanks for following along, and we would love, love, love to see you part of our Facebook group, Brittany Barnes Boutique Epoxy Tumbler Art. We have lots of fun in there with some exclusive giveaways. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel so you can catch all of the upcoming tutorials, and tap the little bell to be notified anytime a tutorial drops. And that is all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all next time.